Good evening and welcome. I'm Hannah Weissman, Executive Director of the Magnus Collection of Jewish Art and Life. If you are new to the Magnus, welcome. We're delighted that you're here tonight. And if you're returning, thank you for your ongoing engagement. The Magnus is a museum dedicated to generating new knowledge and understanding of Jewish cultures around the world, which we do through exhibitions and programs drawn from and connected to the approximately 60,000 objects, artworks, images, and documents in our care. We frequently work in collaboration with community and campus partners, just as we're doing tonight. This evening, the Magnus and the UC Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies are delighted to partner with Toby Philanthropies to present the second annual Eva and Martin Libitsky Memorial Lecture, which will be delivered momentarily by Koret Professor of Jewish History and former Magnus Faculty Director John Efron. We thank our co-sponsors, Riva and David Barrelson, the Magnus Museum Foundation, and the San Francisco-Krakow City Sister Cities Association. I also offer thanks to our partners who helped gather this large and lively audience tonight. The Jewish Community Center of the East Bay, welcome Melissa Chapman, Sarah Wolfman-Robichaud, and Sarah Feynman. The Graduate Theological Union's Center for Jewish Studies, welcome Dr. Dina Aronoff. New Lair House, the Polish Club at UC Berkeley, welcome Emil Albrechtchevitz. The university's Arts and Humanities Development Team, including Jesse Anton, Rebecca Rickson, Ann Vo, and Karen Huang, as well as the Magnus's own dedicated staff, working tonight, Laura Bratt, Andrea Calderon, Julie Franklin, and Tyler Keeler. We're proud to welcome the second and third generations of the Libitsky family, Moses and Susan Libitsky, Moses' sister Ann Petrowski and her husband Nathan Petrowski, as well as their children, Stacy and Sharon. On behalf of the Magnus, I am pleased to take this occasion to thank Moses and Susan for their loyal, ongoing support. In recent years, they've supported the processing of the remarkable Roman Vishniak archive, which Mara Vishniak-Cohn, the photographer's daughter, donated to the Magnus in 2018. Vishniak is most well known for his photographs capturing the daily lives of East European Jewish communities in the interwar years, some of which are from Łódź, Poland, where Eva and Martin Libitsky were born. To learn more about Eva and Martin and to introduce Moses Libitsky, I invite Shana Penn, an Executive Director of Toby Philanthropies, to the podium. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of Tad and Diane Toby and Toby Philanthropies, we're delighted to see everyone tonight and to be able to present with our co-hosts, the Magnus and the Center for Jewish Studies, this special presentation by John Efron, whom I'll be introducing a little later. First, it's my honor to be able to introduce Moses and to speak a bit about his parents, his and Ann's parents, Eva and Martin Libitsky. When Eva Libitsky passed away in May 2021, surrounded by family in her Florida home, our country and the world at large was still in the throes of the pandemic. The first COVID vaccinations were just being made available, remember? Well, even during the pandemic, Eva's children, Moses and Ann, traveled regularly to Florida from Oakland to visit her, and especially once she was diagnosed with COVID. After a difficult period, Eva recovered from COVID, though the virus had taken its toll on this petite, beautiful, strong-willed 97-year-old woman who for many decades dedicated herself to transmitting Holocaust memory through in-person and virtual presentations, visiting with school kids, gifting family photographs to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and authoring a memoir, Out on a Ledge, with editor Fred Rosenbaum. which the Lubitsky family has made available to all of you. You'll find copies on the table in the lobby on your way out, and if by chance we run out of copies, please contact me and we will make sure that we will get copies to you. So Eva, whom I knew, and her husband Martin, whom I regret not having met, were both born in Łódź, the second largest Jewish community in pre-World War II Poland, and the second largest ghetto that the Nazis constructed during their wartime occupation of Poland. Martin had one brother and three sisters. When the war broke out, he was fighting in the Polish army and was in Warsaw. He was sent to a military prison, but when it was discovered that he was a Jew, he was sent to the Łódź ghetto. There he worked as a fireman. And from the Lodz ghetto, Martin was sent to Auschwitz and then on to a factory where he built propellers for airplanes. He was liberated by the Russians from Auschwitz. Eva, at age 15, watched her home life come to an end in September 1939, when she and her family were taken to the Łódź ghetto. Her father died of starvation at the age of 52, and in August 44, the ghetto was evacuated. Eva and her mother were transported to Auschwitz, where her mother was killed immediately. Eva survived. She was later transported to Odoran, and in May 45, she was liberated by the Russian army, the only survivor in her family. She met Martin shortly after being liberated, and they were married in 1946 in a displaced persons camp in Germany where Moses was born. In 1949, the young family moved to Connecticut, and in 91 retired to Pompano Beach, Florida. Martin died in 2012. Eva continued to travel, play bridge and mahjong, play at the casinos, cruise the Caribbean, and enjoy her offspring. Learning and understanding how Jews lived in World War II and how they died in the Holocaust form a family mission for the second and third generations of Lubitskys and Petralskys, passed on to them by their parents. 10 or so years ago, Eva, Moses, and Anne brought their ganze Mishpacha to Poland to visit her and Martin's childhood neighborhoods in Łódź, explore remnants of the Łódź ghetto, and journey to Auschwitz. Tad Toby, like Moses and Anne, is also devoted to transmitting his family legacy in Poland to his offspring, as well as to Jews in the Bay Area and beyond. Moses and Tad are partners on many Jewish heritage projects in Poland and here in the Bay Area. After Eva's passing, Tad and I in the foundation wish to honor both parents and honor Moses and the Lubitsky-Petralsky clan for their dedication to Jewish memory, life, and learning by establishing this annual memorial lecture. And with that, I'd like to introduce Moses to speak about Martin and Eva, who inspired his dedication to Holocaust education and remembrance. Moses.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Shana. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is really a nice crowd. I want to thank the Taube Foundation, thank Tad and Diane and Shana for sponsoring this event. And also want to thank Riva and David Berelson and the Magnus Foundation and all the sponsors for making this possible. So thank you very much. I'm really glad that we can get together tonight and learn about Jewish humor. You can see this says from Lodz to Tel Aviv. There's a link. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit. My parents would have loved to hear about humor and Lodz and this comedy duo. What they wouldn't have loved so much to hear about is what's happening today. So, unfortunately, that's not very humorous. Israel on October 7th was a victim, and instead of Israel, you can read the Jews too, where it is a victim of a horrible pogrom, and today is being vilified for just defending itself. This is anti-Semitism in disguise, really, or maybe it's not so much of a disguise. So what people don't realize, what people don't think about is that this attack on Israel was really an attack on the West and our values, and in effect, this attack on all of us. So we all want to show a lot of compassion for all the individuals being hurt. but we also need to have consciousness of what's exactly at stake here. So consciousness and compassion need to be combined. It's time for us to be aware of all the threats, not just to Israel, but to all of us. My parents always talked about many things, but one of the things they talked to us about frequently is the idea of never again. And we can see that never, well, there isn't any never anymore. All we have is again. So we have to make sure that the echo of the 1930s, which I hear in many of the things that are going on today, in many of the demonstrations going on today, the echoes are all around us, and so it behooves us to listen, to pay attention, and not to fail to act. So that's the only way we can prevent again. So again, I just want to thank John for this talk tonight about Jewish humor and the link from Lodz to Tel Aviv, and I've said enough. So thank you very much, and John.
John Efron is the Corrett Professor of Jewish History at Berkeley, where he's a specialist in the cultural and social history of German Jewry. A native of Melbourne, Australia, he has a BA from Monash University, has studied at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, took his MA at NYU, and earned a PhD at Columbia University. In his work, John has focused on the way German Jewry attempted to reinterpret and reinvent Jewish culture in the wake of its complex encounter with modernity. His work has focused on the German Jewish engagement with medicine, anthropology, and anti-Semitism. He's also written on Jewish political and popular culture in Central and Western Europe, and the role of sport in the modern Jewish experience, including a study of Daniel Mendoza, the 18th century Anglo-Sephardic bare-knuckle boxing champion of the world, and the representation of Jews in the fan culture of Eastern Europe, of English soccer. Eastern Europe just comes out of me so easily. Along with the many books he has published, he has just completed a new book entitled All Consuming, Germans, Jews, and the Meaning of Meat, M-E-A-T. It's a cultural history of the role played by meat in the ordering of German and Jewish self-perceptions and perceptions of the other from the Middle Ages until today. Tonight, John is going to speak on Yiddish political satire. From the late 1920s to the outbreak of World War II, the comedy duo of Szymon, Dzigan, and Yisroel, Schumacher enjoyed unparalleled popularity in Poland's world of Yiddish entertainment. Their satirical monologues and political skits represented an unprecedented development in the nature of Jewish entertainment, modernist humor. After the Holocaust and their emigration to Israel, they trained their satirical observations on the contemporary political situation there. Truly household names, they also toured the world, playing to packed houses wherever they went. Tonight's talk is entitled From Lodz to Tel Aviv. I should say from Lodz to Tel Aviv because we're speaking Yiddish. The Yiddish satire of Szymon, Dzigan, and Yisroel. Schumacher, welcome, John.
Good evening, nice crowd. I always wanted to say, anyone here from out of town? Yes, thank you for the introduction, Shana. I study the Yekkers, but these are really my people, okay? So thanks for, it was Shana who asked me to deliver this lecture, and I'm very grateful, and thank you for that. And thank you to all the hosts, the sponsors and partners, and Moses and Lubitsky and Ann Petrowski for making this annual lecture possible. It's really an honor and a privilege to deliver it. Now, it's a truism that one should never have to explain a joke. If one does, it means something has gone horribly wrong. Now, if you have to both explain and translate a joke, you really have an uphill battle on your hands. So I will try my best to make this as painless and as informative as possible. It helps a lot if you understand Yiddish, but it's not 100% necessary, okay? So, but you will be hearing this, you will be hearing Yiddish tonight. For some 50 years, Szymon, Dzigan, and Yisroel Schumacher, stand-up comedians, political satirists, actors, and masters of the spoken Yiddish word, were among the greatest and most important Jewish entertainers of the modern period. They were also the most famous Yiddish performers in the world. When they were born in Lodz at the turn of the century, the Jewish population of the city stood at about 75,000. By 1939, Lodz's population had climbed to 233,000, the second largest in Poland. I'm not sure. Oh, hang on a second. Excuse me. Okay, so there is Lodz right here, and you can see, and there is Warsaw, and you can see what's significant about this is a kind of a rhomboid. Warsaw to Lodz to Radom, which is where my mother is from, and then to Lublin. And so this area has a particular kind of Yiddish, and I will speak about that tonight. Now, an ugly industrial city, even the authors of Lodz's Yisroel, the memorial book, had difficulty in painting a romantic picture of the city, claiming that, and I quote from the Yisroel, there were no gardens, no attractive houses, and the grey smoke from the factory chimneys covered the sky. And here we can see one of the great industrial businesses of Lodz, that is the Scheibler cotton mill. It was huge and employed hundreds of people. However, the relative drabness of Lodz's physical space belied what lay beneath the surface, namely a sparkling Jewish cultural life. Known as Poland's most Jewish city, Lodz produced an exciting and impressive array of cultural, business, and political leaders, the high point of their activities coming in the interwar years. Julian Tuwim, perhaps Poland's greatest poet, was born in Lodz and wrote his first poems there. The pianist Arthur Rubinstein and the artist whose paintings and drawings we have, Arthur Schick, famed for his extraordinary Haggadah and much else besides, were natives of the city. The interwar years also produced writers such as Yitzhak Katznelson, Yisrael Rabon, and the poet Moshe Broderson. Closely connected to this, because politics would dominate the subject matter of Dzigan and Schumacher's material, interwar Lodz also saw the development of a rich, diverse, and notoriously fractious Jewish political life. And here is a picture of an attempt to form a general Jewish bloc in 1930 of the different political parties. And you can see clearly how it worked out. So there's the word bloc, and this is Mizrahi, and this is Agudah. So these are two religious parties. They're beating the hell out of each other. And then you have a Zionist here and a Folkist here, and this is a Soicher. He's a businessman, and here is he's throttling a worker. Now, we know far less about Schumacher's childhood and career because he never wrote an autobiography. We do know that he was educated in a Hebrew gymnasium, but fortunately for us, Dzigan did write an autobiography. Born into poverty, his childhood revolved around the life in the apartment complex courtyards known as the Heif. The Heif is the singular for courtyard, and the Heif is the plural for courtyard. In his autobiography entitled Der Koech von Jiddischen Humor, The Strength of Jewish Humor, he describes in great and colourful detail his Heif, his courtyard, as home to a colourful cast of working-class Jews. The courtyards were Lodge's equivalent of Sholem Aleichem's third-class carriage. Right? Sholem Aleichem wrote about the third-class carriage where the poorest of the Jews gather, but that carriage is sort of the most fun to be in. They were home to the real Jews, as Dzigan called them. Dzigan's people, he called them, they were his people, and they were the source upon whom he and Schumacher modelled so many of their characters. Now, what I want to do this evening is discuss three things. First is the nature of their humour. The second, I want to discuss their greatest inspiration, Sholem Aleichem. And three, their political satire, both in Poland and then later in Israel. So first, the nature of their humour. Their trademark comedic approach was biting satire and wicked ridicule, or in Yiddish, chozik. To make chozik of someone is to ridicule them. While Dzigan and Schumacher were heirs to the literary and satirical traditions of the early 19th century Galician Haskalah, they also differed markedly from authors such as Yosef Perel and other masters of the genre, insofar as the object of their ire was not the Jewish other, namely Hasidim. If it is such critiques that mark the self-conscious and thus modern sensibilities of Eastern European maskilim of the 19th century, Dzigan and Schumacher's artistic contribution represents a further working out of Jewish modernity. By the interwar period, Poland's secular Jews had nothing to fear from the ultra-Orthodox. How to be a Jew, secular or religious, was really a debate that belonged to another time, or so it seemed, right? It's never gone away. Instead, the only identifiable group of Jews in Poland who did become grist for Dzigan and Schumacher's comedic mill were the assimilationists. Furthermore, for Dzigan and Schumacher, Yiddish was not merely an instrumentalist choice as it had been for maskilim and even initially for the founders of modern Yiddish literature, but rather a thoroughly natural, unconscious and beloved form of expression. Yiddish was, to quote literature scholar Benjamin Harshav, quote, a repository of a whole semiotics of discourse and world views, unquote. Through Yiddish, Dzigan and Schumacher were best able to hold up a mirror to their landsmen, to their fellow Polish Jews. But unlike the mirror held aloft for Jewish society by their maskilic forebears, they held it up in front of themselves as well, as they stood together and not apart from their audiences. Occasionally, and at important historical junctures, as we'll soon see, the pair courageously took aim at non-Jews. But when Dzigan in particular aimed his satirical barbs at Jews, it was those who lived in what are called the Hoche Fenster, the upper floors, where the high windows are. That's where the wealthier Jews lived. It's a sarcastic term for the upper classes. After their arrival in Israel, it was not so much class that separated one group of Jews from another. Rather, their principal targets were variously new immigrants, the olim, and the bureaucrats, the pakidim. And above them all were the Israeli politicians. Of all the groups they satirized, they, in fact, served as the Jewish other, in the way that Hasidim had for maskilic satirists of a previous age. Their attacks were also acts in defense of Jews just like themselves, the everyman, der Yid von der ganz Jure. It's impossible to translate. It's the Jew for a whole year. It's the everyman, right? The every Jew. They loved the Pushet Yid, the simple Jew, with simple tastes. Dzigan, for example, always came on stage and he addressed the audience as Meine Yidden, my Jews. The material of the modern Jewish stand-up comedians, such as Dzigan and Schumacher, bear only scant relation to that of Jewish entertainers of bygone eras. There are borrowings and traces of the performances of the Marshallik or the Badchen who used to perform at weddings, but I would argue that Dzigan and Schumacher's comedy represented something novel, an unprecedented and eloquent expression of Jewish modernity. While their humor is full of the ancient argumentative questioning that Hashav claims is inherent to Yiddish because, he writes, it internalized and schematized some essential characteristics of Talmudic dialectical argumentation and questioning, Dzigan and Schumacher's performances in Yiddish are nonetheless modernist insofar as they are absent the Mussar, that is the ethical teachings, and parochialism of their artistic forebears. Their humor is secular, sort of, as secular as Yiddish can be, which it can't be entirely secular, universalist, peppered with psychological insight and marked by deep cynicism about human foibles and life's absurdities, particularly its bureaucratic and political ones. Their political satire marks them off as belonging to a culture that had become increasingly secular, highly politicized, and deeply engaged with its surroundings. And yet this culture's self-consciousness in Poland was accompanied by a high degree of unself-consciousness, especially about Judaism, Yiddish, and Yiddishkeit, elements inseparable to Dzigan and Schumacher and their audiences. These were not ideological positions that were taken, but rather natural expressions of being. Despite the secularism and universalism of Dzigan and Schumacher's themes, the intense celebration of Yiddishkeit in their comedy in both its dialogical and monological forms, the non-Jew almost entirely disappears, especially in the second half of their careers. At that point, their humor, like the courtyards that Dzigan and Schumacher played in as children, are populated by Jews and Jews alone. Goyim do not serve as comedic foils or as objects of humorous affection because their relationship to Jews has, especially in recent Polish history, been one of antagonism. That doesn't mean, however, non-Jews were never referenced. Dzigan and Schumacher were fearless performers, and before they left Poland, non-Jews do play a prominent role in their act before the war. Taking Polish nationhood ever so seriously and fearing retaliation from Hitler's Germany for any anti-Nazi sentiments, the zealous Polish censors were in no mood in the 1930s to have Poland or Germany be made objects of derision. Dzigan and Schumacher, however, were defiant. In 1935, they opened a theatre in Warsaw with the goal of performing political satire. Here, Choisik, ridicule, was elevated to high art. Their targets were threefold: Polish anti-Semites, Nazis, and as Dzigan recalled most bitterly 4 decades later, Assimilatoren was kriechen noch alles auf alle vier. Assimilations that crawled after everything on all fours. It does sound better in Yiddish, doesn't it? The assimilationists, of course, disappear from their act once in Israel. The most brilliantly satirical and courageous of Dzigan's sketches in this period, to include non-Jews as part of the dramatis personae, is the one entitled The Last Jew in Poland. The sketch is unfortunately lost, but Dzigan has left us a detailed description of it. And this is what the sketch was. The anti-Semites, he writes, wished to make Poland Judenrein, and it came to pass. But when the Poles look around and see how bad things are, then they notice that commerce stops, the economy is in ruins, and culture and entertainment are dead. The anti-Semitic student fraternities wander around, but there is no one to attack. Nicht wehmen zu schlugen is what he writes. On the spot where there once stood the renowned Café Ziemiansko, where people of the arts scene gathered, there is now a funeral parlor. What the Poles ask is to be done. They need to find a Jew. A Jew is found. He was late, departing Poland, and he's getting ready to leave. A government delegation comes to him, begging him to stay. The students organise a campaign to prevent the last Jew from leaving Poland. They offered to make him a banquet and perform Yiddish songs for him. The Jew sets a condition. He wants a piece of gefilte fish and a cholent. The Polish radio appeals to its listening audience for anyone who knows how to prepare such foods, telling them that they would present themselves at once. They find someone and they promise the Jew all possible benefits, and in the end, the Polish government awards the Jew the Polonia Restitucja medal. The Jew accepts the medal at a huge ceremony, and as Dzigan notes euphemistically, he pins it zu dem Oret niedrige von Rücken, the place just below where the spine is, right, on his tuchus. And when he turns, he's got the medal pinned to his tuchus. They can see that there's already a medal hanging there. He's received another medal, the Krzyż Zasługi, the Cross for Services to Poland. The spotlight falls on both medals, and all those on stage sing to the Jew the well-known Polish song, Stalat, may you live 100 years. In this narrative, normative values and outcomes become subverted. For this time, anti-Semitism causes the Gentiles to suffer, not the Jews. Their country has become a boring wasteland, while for the Jew, the attitude of the majority becomes the vehicle for their emigration and thus liberation. The novel twist that Dzigan puts on the older trope of a shared existence and the collapse of that dream is that the last Jew in Poland also has the last laugh. Dzigan forces Poles to reap what they've sown, symbolised by the empty stage at which the audience is now forced to stare as the last Jew takes his leave behind the curtain. In 1935, delivering this monologue was an act of significant political courage. In fact, Dzigan was hauled into police headquarters the next morning, and questioned at length before finally being released. Now, at the core of their humour is a combination of several crucial ingredients, and I'll just name two of them. First is the material itself. It's remarkably strong and genuinely hilarious. The writing is crisp and delivered, whether as monologue or as dialogue, with precision and verve. Here they stand in the great tradition of Sholem Aleichem, who was known to delight audiences with well-rehearsed and deeply evocative readings of his own work. The second feature that contributed to Dzigan and Schumacher's humour was their particular brand of Yiddish. They refused to adopt the standardised language used in Eastern European Yiddish theatre. Instead, their Yiddish was that of Lodz, a piquant and highly colourful Polish Yiddish, lyrical and earthy at one and the same time. They were wonderfully dexterous with the language, modulating pace and tone and taking special delight in word plays and rhymes. Dzigan performed long monologues, anywhere from 8 to 15 minutes. Some were adaptations of Sholem Aleichem, especially the latter's monologues, where the monologuist begins with a few general comments, moves to his specific gripe, and then fans out far and wide, regularly returning to the main subject matter. However, Dzigan's monologues differ from Sholem Aleichem's insofar as they are more immediate. Where Sholem Aleichem as an author borrowed from the Russian literary genre skaz to produce the illusion of oral speech, Dzigan, as an actor, was able to muster the power of Yiddish orality to produce an unmediated and deep connection with the audience. Sketches were drawn from styles current in contemporary Warsaw cabaret. Here there were two principal styles. There was literary cabaret, which was mainly sketches, songs, monologues, and parodies, many of which were political, and a second style of cabaret called revue, which were composed basically of song and dance routines and scantily clad women. Dzigan and Schumacher's work was squarely in the tradition of the literary cabaret. And I'm not sure, why this is not. Yeah, so this is a poster, a beautiful expressionist poster from what is called the Kleinkunst Theatre, the small artistic theatre called Ararat, okay, as you know. So this brings us to our second subject, that is their artistic inspiration, who I've mentioned a few times now. One of the novelties of a Dzigan and Schumacher performance lay in the way that they adopted Sholem Aleichem, but did not turn in merely imitative or verbatim performances of the master's works. Rather, the adaptations were opportunities for flights of original comedy genius. One classic monologue of Dzigan's, Der Söhne von Vakatius, The Enemy of Vacations, owes a debt to Sholem Aleichem's monologue written in 1909 called Talk About the Riviera. Sholem Aleichem's monologuist is a recalcitrant traveller to the Riviera, a discontented Jew suffering not from discrimination at this seaside playground, but exactly the opposite. His discomfort emanates from his being there. His incomprehensibility at finding himself on the Riviera renders him incredulous that the modern Jewish condition has come down to this. Above all, this Italian playground is nothing more than expensive goyim nachas. The monologuist complains bitterly about the trip, especially the cost and the fleecing of patients by resident physicians. So in Europe, you can go to these spas, resorts, and there are resident physicians there, okay? So this is Sholem Aleichem. Talk about the Riviera, thanks but no thanks. Because the Riviera is the kind of place they've got over in Italy that doctors have thought up only to squeeze money out of people. The sky is always blue there, same old sky as back home. Sun is the same too, only the sea, that's the worst part. Because all it does is heave and crash about and make a thundering nuisance of itself. And by God, you never stop paying for it either. Why pay for it? No reason at all. One good thing about the place, though, give credit where credit is due, it's warm there. It's always warm there, the whole blasted year, both summer and winter. Yes, but what's the point? The point is the sun keeps you warm. Well, yes, but what's the point? Keep a good fire going at home and you won't be cold either. Air, they say. Well, yes, the air it isn't too bad. Doesn't smell too bad either. It's got a kind of a fragrance to it. Only it's not the air that smells. It's the oranges that smell. Out there they grow oranges. But I don't know if that's enough reason to be travelling all that way for it. It seems to me there is air all over, and you can buy oranges at home anyway. So, just one second. Where's the phone? Oh, you're going to play the phone? The phone? It's supposed to be here. Okay, wait a second. Okay, so I want to compare this to Dzigan's classic monologue, Der Söhne von Vakatius. Dzigan performed this in Israel, and the social situation, so changed from that of interwar Poland, is reflected in the material, while at the same time the broader worldview, especially the Goyim Nachas that the monologue exhibits, points to an earlier epoch in Jewish sensibility. Instead of anti-Semites, time, leisure, and disposable income have now become the enemy of the Jews. Der Söhne of the title, the enemy, refers to the monologuist, a lazy Israeli bureaucrat who claims, without a hint of embarrassment, that he doesn't need a holiday because as a bureaucrat, for a ganz Jahr ich tue nicht in Hand in kalten Wasser. For a whole year, I don't even dip my hand in cold water. It doesn't translate, but it means I do nothing for the whole year. But he and his wife are solidly middle class, and she insists that they go on a holiday. He would rather not go, preferring to make chozik of anything and everything at the overpriced resort. And this is a classic example of Dzigan's non-political satire. So do we have that?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great.
Right, you ready?
Yeah.
Akal Eden, was heißt sich mit deiner Vakantie? Ihr fuhr? Ich nicht. Als ein Skal Mensch wie ich tun ich fuhr. Na, der aber so. Wo probiert zu tun auf Vakantie? Ze groep prien van de arbeid. Ich arbeite. Ich bin der Beamte, ein Paket. Ich sage ganz jüt ich nicht, der Hand in kalten Wasser. Da wusste ich hier auf Vakantie. Ich schicke während von Leidegang. Als Kuten spiele ich nicht. Kuten, es gibt Vereine, was hat einen leichten Kopf und einen schweren Käschen. Bei mir ist verkehrt. Ich habe einen leichten Käschen und einen schweren Kopf. Wo ist es noch du zu tun auf Vakantie?
Did you, I don't know, so he said, he doesn't play cards, but cards is for someone who has sort of an empty head and heavy pockets. He said with him, he's got a heavy head and empty pockets. So exactly the opposite. Continue. Yeah.
Schlafen Bato. Negate. Naschel schlafen Bato. Wer hat von mir?
What am I going to do? Sleep in the day? And if I sleep in the day, who's going to sleep for me at night?
Schlafen bei Nacht. Was noch kann ich tun auf Vakatie? Reden mit Menschen. Ich bin nicht kein Redder. Ich bin schon 30 Jahre nach der Gassene.
Okay, some of us are a little old-fashioned. What am I going to do on vacation? Speak with people? I'm not a speaker. I've already been married for 30 years.
Du gewohnt von Reden. Reden. Wo soll ich reden mit Menschen? Politik? Als Schuhe den Nerven. Wegen Liebe. Ich fuhr dem auf Vakatie allein. Ich nehme dich mit meiner Wab. Nur meine Sonnen sollen fuhren auf Vakatie mit eigenen Wabe und reden wegen Liebe mit fremden Wabe. Mehr fehlt mir nicht. Und wenn ich wollte gefuhren allein, wollte ich ja geredet wegen Liebe. Kein Red, ich habe schon vergessen, mit was mich mein Nest ist. Wegen was noch kann man reden mit Menschen auf Vakatie? Wegen Kultur. Ich mich nicht sie zu dem. Ich habe mich schon einmal abgebrüht. Ich habe einmal herangeworfen zwischen Menschen ein Wort wegen Shakespeare. Kann ich mich nicht reinwaschen bis nach hartigen Tod. Ich habe mich herausgehabt, dass der Shakespeare wohnt gegenüber mir mit der 2 Hasewarte. Ich habe mich gewollt aufessen. Wer soll wissen, er hat sich schon herausgezogen. Ich finde damals zu ihm, als ich reden wegen Kultur am Pfläufig wie der Pfeffer wächst. Ist was noch kämen auf Akazie? Leine Bücher. Choschen nicht mehr, was zu tun. Sitzen in einem Hotel mit Pension, 62 Pfund Tattoo, im Bagrum als eine Tage Zeit auf kleine Bücher. Wo sollen mich die Bücher machen Kriege? Die Schraube wollen mich lernen Zeichel. Als sei allein noch nicht gezeichelt. Weil wenn die Schraube so ein Zeichel, wollten sie sich ausgesicht, eine bessere Penuse wie zu schreiben Bücher.
Right. So what am I going to do? Read books on vacation? What am I going to learn from books? I'm going to learn books. I'm going to read books that the authors have written. If the authors had any seichel, they wouldn't have become writers to begin with, and they would have had a better panusa, a better living. Elsewhere, Dzigan betrayed his inspirations more overtly. So take, for example, his show called Doktorim heißen Lachen, Doctors Prescribe Laughter, which he performed in 1969 at Beit Shalom Aleichem in Tel Aviv. In the opening monologue, entitled A Shmuris mit Shalom Aleichem, a chat with Shalom Aleichem, Dzigan says to him, "It's a pity that you weren't born 70 years later. For here in Israel, you'd have material to make you laugh and cry for years to come." And then at the outset of the sketch, he reminds Shalom Aleichem of what he had once said. Hat gesagt, als Lachen ist geht. Doktoren heißen Lachen. Ich weiß nicht, dass Doktoren heißen Lachen. Ich weiß nur, dass heißen sich ganz gut zu bezahlen. So doctors prescribe laughter. I'm not sure if I don't know if the prescription is a real one, but what I do know is that they prescribe their fees for themselves. Again, it's very hard to translate. The final category that I want to look at is political satire. And this was at the heart of their humour from the very beginning. A sketch they performed in Lodz as the two members of opposing Jewish political parties sitting in a sukkah with one another until symbolically the structure entirely collapses. Out of the mouths of the protagonists, Jewish politics and politicians are subjected to utter ridicule. The sketch draws to a close with the two building a hot air balloon, replete with mezuzahs, wherein they take off for the stratosphere, still arguing politics. Now, this was actually drawn, I think, I don't have any evidence for this, but it's a pretty safe bet. This is from 1918, so it's before the time, but this is from a newspaper. It's a cartoon in a newspaper called The Sukkah in Danger. And here you have all of these Jewish representatives of political parties arguing, and what they haven't paid attention to is the pig that has written in Yiddish on it, conservative reactionary. And he's already bashed into this pillar, and the sukkah is about to come down. In May 1939, they left Warsaw. At a farewell performance, Schumacher concluded with a speech to the audience about the difficulty of having to leave. He said farewell to the patrons and to a fly that was buzzing around him. I'll read the original, then I'll translate it for you. Sag gesinnt flieg, ich fuhr weg und los dich über. Gleib mir flieg, ich bin dir nicht mehr kann. Die kannst frei fliehen, wie ihr hin du willst und wenn du willst. Die weiß nicht von Emigratie-Schwierigkeiten, von kein Pass, von kein Visa, von kein Affidavit. Gleib mir flieg, ich bin schwacher von dir. Goodbye, fly. I'm leaving Poland and I leave you here. Believe me, fly, I am envious of you. You can fly freely wherever and whenever you want. You don't know from emigration difficulties or about passports or about visas or about affidavits. Believe me, fly, I am weaker than you. With the Nazi invasion of Poland in September 1939, Dzigan and Schumacher fled to Soviet-occupied Bialystok after they learned their names were on a Gestapo blacklist. There they re-established their company and toured the Soviet Union, playing before Yiddish-hungry audiences. When they attempted to leave the Soviet Union, they were arrested and spent 4 years in prison, first in Tashkent and then in a labor camp in Kazakhstan. There, they were, however, permitted to perform, both for Jews from the surrounding areas and at NKVD banquets, the NKVD being the predecessor of the KGB. Released in 1946, they were arrested in Lvov, but they were finally able to reach Warsaw in 1947. Shortly thereafter, they made one of the very first Holocaust films, the classic Unsere Kinder, Our Children. It's set in the Helenavok orphanage just outside Lodz with real child survivors. The film focuses on how Jewish child survivors dealt with the trauma of the Holocaust and how it can be best represented. So in the film, Dzigan and Schumacher perform for the children, and one sketch is a song and dance number set in the ghetto. And then the camera turns to the balcony where the children are, and they start booing Dzigan and Schumacher and screaming at them, "Sinish azoy gewein, sinish azoy gewein." It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. And Dzigan and Schumacher then, in the film, retreat to their dressing room, utterly devastated. Determined to find out what was wrong about their representation of the Holocaust, they invite the children into their dressing room to set the record straight for them, to ask them what happened. So, the next sketch. Just a second. And this is a short scene of what happens in the dressing room with the children.
Entschuldigung. Mischke, bitte bewerkt ist.
Das bist die der größte Held. Sag noch. Was hast du gebeten?
Weil es nicht gewesen soll. Aber nicht. Oder mir leid in Ghetto haben wir so nicht das gesehen. Oder mir leid in Ghetto hat man nicht geschenkt bei alles. Ein Mann im Ghetto hat nicht gehabt, kein Koch auf die Füße zu gehen.
Ein Mann im Ghetto hat nicht gehabt, kein Koch zu tanzen nach Kosak.
Ein Mann im Ghetto hat gehabt, geschwommene Füße.
Wann weißt ihr, Kinder? Ihr seid gewesen im Ghetto?
Ist gewesen, als Schmuggler ist gewesen.
Oh, Herr ist der Maßer, bitte. Na, in die was bist gewesen?
Ist gewinn, a Haber ist gewinn.
A was?
A Haber!
Er hat er heute Brot auf der Gas.
Nicht damit,
Jo.
Ja, ich bin gewesen, ein Titzer bin ich gewesen. Wir haben aufgenarrt die Gendarmen auf der Wache, haben wir aufgenarrt. Haben wir gemacht, das Stutschne Trog, der Deid soll uns nachlaufen, in der Weile ist ein reiner Wugensreuer durch ein Teuer. In der Nuch hat mir genommen eine Dolle.
Hat mein gehabt gewinn.
It's on. I think the whole thing is on YouTube, and I really recommend it to you heartily. They arrived in Israel in 1950, and in that same year they staged their first performance in Israel as guest actors, a status that allowed them to circumvent the government-sponsored ban prohibiting local actors from performing in Yiddish, which was in force in 1949 and 1950. In order to limit the power of the Yiddish theatre in the State of Israel, the Films and Plays Censorship Committee permitted guest actors to appear in Israel for periods of only 6 weeks at a time. However, due to their status and fame, Dzigan and Schumacher were allowed to continue performing beyond this limited period, on the condition that they included Hebrew sections amounting to 1/3 of every performance. They did this by incorporating Hebrew songs performed by Israeli singers in between their own sketches. Once in Israel, their repertoire expanded. Themes included the individual confronting Israeli bureaucracy, Yiddish versus Hebrew, new immigrants, the nuclear arms race, the Jewish-Arab conflict, relations between diaspora Jewry, especially American Jews, and Israel, the memory of Jewish life in Eastern Europe, and the Holocaust. They spent a good deal of time outside the country. In 1951 and 52, they managed their own theatre in Buenos Aires. They played in the United States, and here you can see they played Carnegie Hall. They were very big. They really were. Forgotten now, but very big. And they returned to Israel and they established a theatre in Tel Aviv in 1958. And their albums sold all over the world. So here we can see, this is called a Best of Dzigan, and so this is from the Anglophone world. And here are the albums that they sold in France. And I couldn't find the ones for Latin America, but the Spanish ones as well. In 1961, Schumacher passed away suddenly at the age of 53, and Dzigan continued as a solo act. Israel was an embattled nation when Dzigan and Schumacher arrived, and it was the tendency of world Jewry at that time to be forgiving of the way the country was run. I'm not referring to Israel's foreign policy or its conflict with the Arabs, but its domestic agenda and quite simply the country's management. When during the first decades of Israel's existence, the apologetic refrain most often heard when something failed was, "But it's a young country," the duo refused to offer up such an excuse, believing that the bureaucracy's sole task was to make life as difficult as possible for its citizens. They had lived in the Soviet Union, and neither it nor communism were to their liking. They were Israeli patriots, but nonetheless fierce critics of the cumbersome and inefficient bureaucracy, and were a watchdog of sorts for politicians and functionaries on the take. This at a time when Hebrew satire was yet to appear. In 1962, Dzigan toured the United States and again recalls the dim view that audiences took of his presentation of the weaknesses of Israeli reality, die schwache Zeiten von der Yisroel der Wirklichkeit, not permitting the merest speck of dust to fall on the state of Israel. The American audiences had, he said, declared his words. In particular, he's making choizik of our ministers to be bevchinat avodah zarah, to be in the category of idolatry. For American Jews, Israel was, he said, to be a shiny samovar used in honor of Yontif. He expressed his gratitude to American Jewry, but also his regret and bitterness towards them for leaving Israelis alone to deal with their internal enemies, the politicians, the bureaucracy, and the economy. He said he refused to be like other Israeli artists who came to the United States and sung about Tel Aviv. He coped with the American Jewish reality by cleverly reworking his act, not directly criticizing Israel, but doing it through a Shalom Aleichem character of his own adaptation, the Yisroel Dicker Menachem Mendel, the Israeli Menachem Mendel. By contrast, in Israel, there was no need to soften the edges of his act, for there, Dzigan's audiences were entirely receptive to his biting political satire. To be sure, the critics didn't always see it that way. In his act, he regularly exhibited fantasies of power, expressing a desire to wrest control from those he believed to be incompetent and self-serving. Wenn Zayat losen mir zi, if they'd let me take the reins, was his favorite refrain. That was a continuous theme in his work from Poland to the Soviet Union to Israel. And one can compare it to Shalom Aleichen's If I Were Rothschild. But instead of seeking wealth, it's political and bureaucratic power and common sense that Dzigan seeks and wishes to see prevail. When Dzigan recorded his live performance at Beit Shalom Aleichem in 1969, Israel was still buoyant from its stunning victory in 1967, and as a nation, super confident. Backing the national sentiment of Jews the world over, Dzigan continued his relentless criticism of Israel's Kafkaesque bureaucracy. If I were in charge, I would liquidate all ministries, he says in the show's opening monologue, A Shmuz mit Shulam Aleichem. His latter-day Menachem Mendel, he said, would dish out makkos to the Egyptians, just as Moshe Rabbeinu had done. But he'd strike them with greater makkos. A makkos is... How would he do this? He'd repeat the great victory of Moshe Rabbeinu, he said, over the Egyptians, by sending them each day our economists, our company directors, and our government ministers. In the sketch, Dzigan dismisses the entire economic and banking system of Israel as one that is completely unable to handle the nation's financial crisis. And there was a financial crisis going on in the country at the time. Railing against the excesses of those with power, he concludes with a brilliant wordplay. So I'll do this, but the final word, I'm going to give you the punchline first. So the final word is bankrot. Bankrot means bankrupt. Okay? Der Finanzminister sagt, als unsere Medina hat nicht kein eigen Geld. Und als hat nicht kein eigen Geld, frage ich auch, brut man so viel Bank? Bank Leumi, Bank Discount, Bank Apoalim. Wer darf haben so viel Bank? Wenn sie es losen mir zieh, mache ich von die alle Bank ein Bank, Bankrott. So the finance minister says that we don't have our own money, the country doesn't have our own money, and I ask you, why do we build so many banks if we don't have any money? Bank Leumi, Bank Discount, Bank Apoalim. Who needs to have so many banks? If they'd let me take the reins, I'd make from all of the banks one bank. Bankrott. In the same sketch, he derides the ministers who drew up economic plan after economic plan to save the country. And each plan had hundreds of points, he says. Again, he declares that if he were in charge, mache ich von die allerhinderte Punkten nur ein Punkt, Punkt verkehrt. So, Punkt verkehrt means exactly the opposite. So he would make from the 100 points the exact opposite. Part of the economic crisis, according to Dzigan, came from the state's policy of subsidizing new immigrants. At the beginning of a scintillating monologue with Schumacher, a rendel avoret, sort of, you can translate it in lots of ways, but silence is golden is one way. There's an interchange between two olim chadashim, wherein he attacked the olim and their sense of entitlement and the government policies that enabled such behavior. Dzigan then goes on to offer a brilliant new economic plan to save the country. And it's called BENTS. So in English it would be B-E-N-T-S, BENTS. BENTS is an acronym for Bedibur Nachutz Tzena, sort of austerity-imposed speech. It's a plan to save money by getting Jews to talk less. To impose, and Israel had an economic austerity program. So he wants an austerity program on Jewish verbosity. By doing so, they free up the valuable time of the listener, who can then become more economically productive. So one of these Olim Chadashim is on a park bench in Tel Aviv, and another one comes along. So it does matter if you don't understand it. But what I want to say is, what I want you to do is just to sort of sit back and hear the interchange between them, because it's incredibly fast. And this is the real McCoy. This is the real Yiddish, okay? So one of them, he comes along. How long have you been here? He says. I've been here 3 months. Drach Chedushim. Been here 3 months. And the other one says, Drach Chedushim. Du bist du noch Drach Chedushim. What are you doing here? A chutzpah from a Yid. It's a chutzpah from a Jew. I'm sitting here on Sterot Rothschild. You should be on Sterot Keren Kayemet, which is a worse neighborhood. So after 3 months, anyway, they end up fighting about who's going to, and then they sit together, then he explains Ben-Stem. It's a long thing, but I'm just going to play the beginning so you hear it. Okay? So the next one. Yeah.
Waarop, zoek nou. Waarop van de bank.
Geht ihr auf.
Geht ihr auf.
Geht auf!
Zoek nou. Ihr seid doch gekommen sitzen?
Nein, ich bin gekommen schlafen. Sagt, dass geht rauf von der Bank, wach will mir Bett ins Bett.
Ich hab pinkt das an rechts geschlafen, auf der Bank pinkt das wie.
Auf der Bank hat ihr rechts geschlafen, also wie ihr?
Ja.
Kickt man da gleich in den ran. Auf der Bank?
Ja.
Also,
ja.
Auf der schönsten Gasse in Tel Aviv?
Ja.
Auf der Rotrotsche?
Ja.
Und ihr rechts geschlafen, also wie ihr?
Ja.
Also, wie lang sind das in der Land?
Ihr?
Ja.
Drach Chedushim.
Er gibt es schlafen auf der Bank in Sterot Keren Kayemet. Ach, jetzt wird das ist von den neuen Olim, den neuen Immigranten. Alles gibt's. Die schönste Bänken, die schönste Gassen. Anders passt es nicht.
Zoek nou, ihr redt also schein, wie lang sind die schon du in Land?
Ich bin schon du von Vater Milchome.
Für welche Milchome? Für der erste oder für der zweite?
Für der dritte.
Der dritte, der Milchome doch noch nicht gewesen.
Jetzt ist er.
Zwischen wem?
Zwischen mir und Tag, als hat Schrubke von der Bank. Geh, schau du!
So he said, how long have you... So one says, I've been here, Drach Chedushim, 3 months. The other one says, how long have you been here? I've been here since before the war. He says, the First World War? No. Second World War? No. The Third World War. What Third World War? The one between you and me if you don't get off this park bench.
Gesehen auch, jetzt beseist von Ayid. Schlufst du die dritte Nacht auf der Bank?
Wie lang schläft du?
3 Nächte.
3 Nächte?
3 Nächte.
Siehst du, du sich rausrieren von der Stiebe auf kann man nicht?
Geht mich herabjugen.
3 Nächte bin ich nicht gekommen in der Gasse ran, aber schön ein fremder jeder angekrochen mit der Fies im Bett ran. Na, was sitzt der?
Sitzt der?
Was steht der?
Was geht der?
Wie geht der?
Kommando, was heißt der? Gekommen mit 3 Wochen früher in London.
Ja, ne schön. Wie geht der? Setzt dich weg.
Oh,
weiß mit wem in der Razzetien. Hat mich geschlafen zusammen. Da sollt wissen, dass Balabu ist von der Bank bin ich. Ihr hat schlufen zu viel.
So he asserts his authority by saying that he's the balabus of the park bench. Right? So let's just look at that. So connected to Olim is the work of the Shlichim, the emissaries of the Jewish agency who would go around the world, of whom he made regularly made brutal choizik. In a Heilung for the Nerven, a cure for the nerves, a sketch performed in Poland and now updated for the Israeli stage. 2 Jews meet each other in a sanatorium, and one asks the other very warily, "Me ken redden Yiddish Wort? Can I speak Yiddish to you?" And he says, "Abada." So they start speaking, and they seek to become very familiar with each other very quickly. And how do they do so? They do so by exchanging riddles, a couple of silly riddles. So one asks the other one, "Wusste du's, steht auf dem Dach, hat 2 Fies und macht Kuckerikoo." What's this? Stands on a rooftop, has 2 feet, and says Kuckerikoo. And he goes, "A huhn, a chicken?" "No, it's nicht a huhn." So he repeats it. He says, "Go nicht a huhn. It's a Michiganer." In response, the other one asks, "Wusste du's? Es hat 4 Fies und macht Mu, a key." A cow. Wusste du's, es hat 4 Fies und macht Meh, a Zieg, a goat. Wusste du's, es hat 4 Fies und macht gar nicht. 2 Schlichim von Yisroel in America. So as part of Dzigan's first show, after he split with Schumacher, in 1960, here they split and then Schumacher died, he began forming a routine in defense of Olim, by attacking the source of their seemingly endless troubles, the Jewish agency, the Sochnut. a most beloved sketch from this period, has a generous sochnut provide him and his wife and 4 children with a spacious apartment. But the agency had erred in promising the same apartment to a certain Zalman Rosenkranz. Dzigan performed 2 versions of this sketch, one with an unfriendly bureaucrat that he had to deal with, and the other one with an overly friendly bureaucrat. Whatever their nature, neither one was able or willing to extricate Rosenkranz from Dzigan's apartment, where Rosenkranz is now even sleeping in the same bed as Mrs. Dzigan. As Dzigan desperately tries without effect to get the Sochnut to recognise its error, his frustration builds and he is rendered a hapless victim of forces he can neither understand nor relate to. Such scenes, and indeed his entire corpus of political satire, indicated the extent to which Dzigan felt alienated from impersonal bureaucracies. His approach was as if Sholem Aleichem had met Franz Kafka. For Dzigan, the only way to deal with these horrors of modern life were through humour and cynicism. Despite being fettered by the political establishment, Dzigan was also somewhat alienated from Israel. In his autobiography, he tells us that only after 22 years in the country, when he stepped on stage at the Heichal HaTarbut in Tel Aviv in January 1972 to celebrate his 40th anniversary on stage, and he took in the applause of the 3,000 people in the audience who packed in to see him, did he feel for the first time a part of the country. 2 decades is a long time to feel alienated from the land that provided safe refuge as well as a loyal following. But here we must recognise the pain of a performer who spoke a language and lived a culture often reviled in the new Hebrew state. The story of Yiddish in Palestine and later the State of Israel is complicated, and all I will say here is that pockets of intense anti-Yiddish sentiment existed at both the popular level, with say, this thuggish street violence of the Gedud Meginei HaSafa, the battalion of defenders of Hebrew, who in the 1920s beat up Yiddish writers and speakers on the streets and attacked kiosk owners for selling Yiddish publications, and at the elite university level with the vociferous campaign in 1927 against the establishment of a chair in Yiddish at the Institute of Jewish Studies at the Hebrew University. The one who was most vociferously advocating in favour of Yiddish, a Yiddish chair, was none other than Gershom Scholem, the great German Jewish scholar of Jewish mysticism. Hebrew had seemingly triumphed. But the long-running battle between Hebrew and Yiddish was reignited with the arrival in the country of hundreds of thousands of Yiddish-speaking Jews, Holocaust survivors. Fearful that Hebrew would be the loser, ideologues and activists stepped up their campaign. That said, Yiddish appeared for a short time to thrive, an impression bolstered by the arrival of so many Yiddish speakers, the fact that there was more Yiddish on the radio in the 1950s than any other language other than Hebrew, and the fact that Mordechai Tzanin, with the help of the courts, was able to defeat Ben-Gurion's plan to stop all Yiddish publication in Israel, the result of being the appearance of Tzanin's highly popular newspaper, Let's Denayas. Ben-Gurion refused to give paper for the newspaper. Yiddish was heard everywhere, and Dzigan and Schumacher continued to play to sell out audiences. And these are some concert posters. And this is a very nice one called Hot a Yid a Ländele, a Jew has a little country, and you can see the map of Israel there. And finally, this one, Besser moret nicht, it's better not to speak. Dzigan also became the darling of the political establishment. Many politicians, such as Shimon Peres, sought him out for material that they could use in the Knesset or in ministerial meetings or in cabinet meetings. He wrote one-liners for them, and then they said them in Hebrew. Levi Eshkol, whom Dzigan personally loved, Golda Meir, Menachem Begin, and the one-time finance minister Pinchas Sapir all kept company with him, and away from the ear of the general public, they relished their get-togethers where they could freely speak Yiddish. The one politician who would never permit himself to appreciate Dzigan was Ben-Gurion. He may have been generally humorless, but there is more involved than just that deficiency. The Prime Minister really displayed a hateful, almost pathological reaction to Yiddish and was an inspiration to the stepped-up campaign against the language after 1948. Of course, he spoke perfect Yiddish himself. In that year, at a celebration commemorating Roska Korczak, the first anti-Nazi resistance fighter to reach Palestine in 1944, Ben-Gurion stormed out in the middle of her talk, being given in Yiddish, protesting that Hasafa tzoremet li ba'ozen, this language grates on my ears. Above all, emblematic of his attitude was his description of Holocaust survivors as avak adam, human dust, a direct result on Dzigan and Zane Yidden, his Jews. With barely concealed contempt, he explained Ben-Gurion's congenital deficiencies by drawing on the midrash of the, so I said secular sort of kinda, he draws on the midrash of the angel who taps the fetus on the lips to create the philtrum. And here it is. Wenn a Kind wird geboren, when a child is born, kisht him a malach, the malach kisses, the angel kisses the child. Git him a kischen kop, wächst daraus a denker. If he gets kissed on the head, he'll grow up to be a thinker. Kisht him auf die Lippen, wird sein a redner, he'll be an orator. Fällt seine Kisch auf die Hand, wird sein a pianist. Wie hat der Malach a Kisch getun Ben-Gurion, als sitzt schon so lang auf seinen Posten? Where did the angel kiss Ben-Gurion that he has sat so long on his post as the Prime Minister? I'm glad you got it. It's where his medal was, okay? By contrast, there was his extraordinary impersonation of Golda Meir. Dzigan wrote and performed the show Goldinyu, Our Dear Golda. And that's him. It's really quite incredible. Speaking to the Israeli public, the real Golda related her story of meeting with the then President Richard Nixon in Washington. The meeting was actually considered a high point of Israeli diplomacy because Golda came away with loan guarantees and an agreement to buy American arms. It was also said that she came away with an American promise to look the other way at Israel's nuclear program. Dzigan didn't mention that. Instead, high politics was presented by him when he did it, Dzigan's rendition of her address to the nation. This is a grab from a TV, right? Instead of high politics, it was presented in the language of Yiddish cultural and literary traditions. In Dzigan's rendering, getting the agreement from Ben-Gurion is presented as the Jewish mother who goes begging to the Poritz, which is the Polish landowner. As she relates to the nation, he says, when we reached New York, the military band played Hatikva, and afterwards, in my honor, they played a bit from my Yiddish mama. Dzigan's Israel is an expanded Jewish family, and its prime minister is the quintessential Jewish mother. In his monologue, Dzigan also emphasizes the tension between Golda's feminine and masculine attributes. Dzigan's Golda says, I spoke to the president, man to man. A reference to Ben-Gurion's famous quip that Golda, quote, is the only real man in the government. Critics raved about the impersonation, which everyone considered perfect, a tour de force. Despite the fact that Dzigan was fettered by Israel's political elite, Golda actually attended his performances, was adored by Yiddish-speaking Israel, and Dzigan and Schumacher had their material performed in Hebrew by Israeli comedians, none other than the famous Israeli comedian Shaker Ophir, who was his son-in-law. So before Hebrew satire had taken off, some of their sketches were translations of stuff from Poland in the 1930s. So despite this, and they played to pack houses, they were on Israel radio, so they were on Kol Yisrael. This is a record from their archives. And Dzigan did TV special. He was on TV as well. He did a TV special. And here is just this is the VCR. I mean, it's now in a disc, but even that. Anyway, so that's Dzigan. He remained, as he said, somewhat apart from the country, and it was language that formed the barrier. To be sure, he and Schumacher spoke Hebrew fluently, but that was beside the point. He was a displaced artist for whom language meant everything. while scores of refugee artists from all over Europe also had tremendous difficulty in finding a voice in another vernacular, the Yiddish artist in Israel found himself or herself in a double bind. Jewish performers or writers who worked in European tongues, for example, continued to work in languages that were still extant. Its speakers may have perished, but German, French, Russian, Polish never drew their lifeblood from the Jews. They were not singularly dependent on them. Not so with Yiddish. Without Jews, it could not survive as a living language. Finally, and this is the second part of the double bind, none of those European languages had suffered the same kind of internal assault on their integrity as Yiddish had. The masculine were long gone, but their latter-day flag bearers on the question of Yiddish, the Hebraist ideologues into whose midst Dzigan and Schumacher now found themselves, continued the battle. As Yiddish was not merely the means by which Dzigan performed his art, but was the art itself, Israel was, culturally speaking, a place of exile for him. And even though the city of Tel Aviv marked Schumacher's house with a plague, a plaque, I'm sorry, a plaque. Have a look at this plaque. You'll notice it has no Yiddish on it. Instead, for some reason, it's in English. Hebrew and English, for no good reason at all. In 1980, at the Ohel Shem Theatre in Tel Aviv, Dzigan performed Doktorim heißen Lachen, Doctors Prescribe Laughter, in honor of the 120th anniversary of Sholem Aleichem's birth. It was opening night and Dzigan collapsed on stage, dying shortly thereafter. A custodian of a culture that was no more, with his passing, Szymon Dzigan became, in a symbolic sense, the last Jew in Poland. I imagine he would have enjoyed the irony. Thank you very much.
So we'd like to take questions. We do have a roaming microphone. If anyone has a question, raise your hand. And please ask question. No. Someone back there had a question? Microphone for you here. Here's the mic. Here comes Max.
Thank you. It's not so much of a question. Just a few things. First of all, only a question. Well, then it's not a question. It's a comment. But sorry.
Thank you, John. Did Schumacher and Dzigan's work and art leave any legacy in Israel, which we can still see today?
Yes, actually, I can. Great. Oh, there it was. I'm sorry. So I want to thank a scholar of Dzigan in Israel, Diego Reutmann, who gave me permission to show this photo. To show this image. Two Israeli artists, Adi Kaplan and Shachar Carmel. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Adi Kaplan and Shachar Carmel painted. There's a lot of photos of images of their paintings of Dzigan and Schumacher. They did scores of them. And if you note the date, it's 2017, and there was an Israeli. There was a long-running and very, very successful run of a theatre performance of Dzigan and Schumacher with actors doing them. And so there's been a revival, and their names are now sort of known throughout Israel. The act was done in Hebrew, but nonetheless, they played Dzigan and Schumacher. So there is a consciousness about them, but it's taken a long time, but they're once again. And of course, I think the most important, the legacy for many people is memories, either they having seen or heard them, or relating to me that their parents knew them or used to listen to their records or something like that. And that's all over the world, you know.
I believe that starting in the early 1920s and throughout that decade, there was a shift from Yiddish among Jews to Polish.
Yeah.
Did Dzigan ever comment in his autobiography that he saw a shrinkage of his audience on the horizon? And tied to that, was there any criticism of his act that it was what then was called Schund theater?
His was not Schund theater. Absolutely not. No, his was highly respectable. As I mentioned, there's two forms of cabaret in Poland in the interwar period, and they performed in what was called literary cabaret. It was a much higher level. Schund was the other stuff, but that was mostly Polish anyway. It's true that in the interwar period, young Polish Jews began to speak Polish. There's absolutely no question about that. When my mother arrived in Australia, she didn't speak Yiddish. She could understand Yiddish, but she was of that generation that were going to grow up as Polish speakers, spoke Polish, and for some reason I've never been able to find out, the family stopped speaking Polish once they got to Australia and completely switched to Yiddish, and she has a magnificent Yiddish. But it was that generation, and they were beginning to speak Polish in very large numbers.
Yeah. I was wondering, and I may have missed this, but did they have any were they grounded in any religious background? And also, was there, I know they were from the second biggest city in Poland, but did their works reach any of the other more rural areas?
Well, they were big artists, so they did tour, of course, but like big artists, I mean, you know, Taylor Swift doesn't go and play in some country town. So they want to go where there are big theatres. You know, they're trying to earn a living. So they toured, but it was in the major cities for the most part. And there was another question which I... Did
they have any religious training?
Oh, any religious training? Oh, I don't know. They were sort of nominally secular Jews, but to be a secular Jew in Poland in the interwar period is to grow up and be a Yiddish speaker, is to grow up deeply infused with religion. It's different from, you know, there's no American cognate example. You're just in this world. It's like, you know, it's like Israel. It's like Israel. There are lots of secular people, but, you know, they're speaking the language of the Bible, sort of. But they're also just in the midst of it. So they know the Jewish calendar, for example. They know when there are holidays. I mean, that kind of thing. They lived in a very Jewish world, but they also lived in a very Polish world too. You know, they're fluent in Polish as well, of course.
In the film about the ghetto children, I noticed that Schumacher did not have a credit under the name Schumacher. It was some other name. What was that about?
I didn't see that.
There was no credit for Schumacher. It was Dzigan and somebody else.
Oh, Nathan Gross.
No, another name.
Let me see if I can. No. Okay. Szymon Dzigan and Charles Goskind with okay. Yeah, no. So Schumacher didn't write the script.
Yeah, I don't know why they did that, but that's the.
the Jewish Film Archive here. I don't know why they did that.
We have time for one more question, and there was this woman over here, Matt. And then we have some time for comments.
Can you say something about the several other films that the comedies they made in Poland before the war? I've noticed the Movie Internet Database lists several of them, and presumably they're still extant. Do you know anything about whether they're available? Have they been restored?
Yes, they've been restored. They're all available. There's a film archive a Yiddish film archive at Brandeis. And that's where, if you go to that website, I think everything is listed there and you'll find that. Yeah, they were big movie stars as well. That wasn't part of my, what I wanted to convey to you tonight, but they were just huge. They played before thousands of people. They were in movies. They were to be seen everywhere. They were household names. But remember, not just household names, but they were household names throughout the Yiddish-speaking world. So they were household names in Argentina. They were household names in Melbourne. They were household names in the United States. Wherever Jews who left, and of course in Poland, but those Jews who left and formed a Polish-Jewish diaspora in the 30s, all of them knew Dzigan and Schumacher. All of them brought their memories of Dzigan and Schumacher, seeing them, hearing them. And they were actually, one thing I will say, they were a little bit, the analogy would be something like Seinfeld. So if you remember Seinfeld, they'd say something, there'd be, I don't know, yada, 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 or something like that. And the next day, the country would be saying whatever was on that night, that Thursday night's episode, right? It had such power, cultural power. Same with them. People would go to a Dzigan and Schumacher show, and the very next day, all over Yiddish-speaking Poland, they were repeating some phrase or some expression or some interplay between the two of them.
Well, I have to say, before I heard John speak about Dzigan and Schumacher, I had never heard of them, and I had studied Yiddish. Who here knew of Dzigan and Schumacher before tonight?
Use the mic.
Microphone for you.
Oh, right here. I'm just wondering how many people knew of the comedy duo before tonight, and for how many is this new information? Well, thank you so much.
I thought you were here for Dzigan and Schumacher, but you were actually here for me. That's
Thank you so much, John.